Hello everybody and welcome back to part 2 of my Nioh boss ranking. If you haven't seen part 1, be sure to check it out via the link in the description. As a quick reminder, this list is based solely on my full playthrough of Nioh this past month, and its RPG nature and the varied builds it offers may make the bosses you and I found difficult very different. Without further ado, here are the remainder of Nioh's bosses ranked from easiest to hardest. Number 15, Yamata-No-Orochi. Much like Oniroki, this is a boss that would change dramatically if I were to rank the bosses across multiple playthroughs. But my blind attempt at the Elemental Hydra offered moderate challenge tied with a stomach-sinking realization. I knew there was no way it'd just be one head, but after KOing the first and seeing the septuple serpentine showdown that remained, I was like, okay, deep breaths. How do I do this? The ensuing panic caused me to forget multiple things that could have made this easier. I had ranged weapons, ranged magic that would have been super effective, and I didn't realize that baiting the heads into the crystals was a viable way to knock them dead. Instead, I baited an attack, most of which I was mediocre at avoiding, then went for the melee beatdown in the brief window they give after each attack. In the beginning, this was no big deal, but once you're surrounded by consistent magic blasts, it turns into a crowd control nightmare. I found it better to use the crystals as cover and slowly work my way counterclockwise, slaying them one by one. Once you thin their numbers, it gets progressively easier until only one remains. Still, I have to say that being surrounded by elemental barrages you can't possibly see all of is a doozy to deal with. I'd love another shot at it to see what I could do with magic bows and guns, but in my first go around, this legendary snake was a sizable hurdle. Number 14, Sarutobi Sasuke. Stand aside, samurai, it's time to get schooled in the way of the shinobi. Once I saw what it did to Yuki-Onna, I was extremely hesitant to use sloth on bosses. But if you're gonna throw the kitchen sink at me, then I'm tossing it back tenfold. Weakness and sloth talismans were a great way to create openings. Thing is, while sloth is undeniably valuable for layering more debuffs at the least, Sasuke was still mobile, blocked well, and threw in so many of his own gadgets at the time slowed offered far less benefit than you might expect. Even my Kato living weapon and red demon armor combo was nothing against his speed and blocking. He used a bunch of different tools: shuriken, paralysis clouds, poison knives, bombs, the works. All intermixed between flashy tonfa flurries and light speed that made him feel like some sort of teleporting wizard. Despite his many advantages, the saving grace and balance is his modest damage output. Instead of emulating Saitama like most DLC bosses, he chips away at you over time. It's a battle of attrition that felt perfectly balanced on both sides, and for that, I thoroughly enjoyed my time against Sasuke. It demanded a lot from me in terms of patience, evasion, and strategy, but never so much that it felt too overwhelming. For that, Sarutobi finds a well-earned spot just inside the top 15. Number 13, Okatsu. This fight exposed a key weakness in my playstyle. I had a huge tendency to sprint around wildly in an effort to reposition, outspace enemies, or rush behind for bonus damage. The small arena mixed with Okatsu's deceptively high speed exploited this strategy perfectly. It forced me to adapt to her quick movements and rely more on close combat counters. She had close melee attacks, ranged moves, and a charge to close the distance in an instant. This charge evolves over the course of the fight to include kicking off the wall. Despite being unable to carelessly sprint away, dodging at the right moment on these charges open huge windows of opportunity. Staying close, countering, and keeping the pressure on works to your advantage if you can manage it effectively. Her key is nothing impressive, giving nice balance in the fast-paced pressure she provides. It feels less like any singular move she had was particularly difficult. Instead, she struck an excellent balance of forcing you to consistently question when you should choose to be offensive or defensive. It was solidly challenging in an enjoyable way, enough for her to lock in a spot at number 13. Number 12, Shima Sakon. Continuing our run on human bosses, Shima Sakon shines as a perfect example of their design in the latter half of Nioh. It's similar to a Revenant fight with their weapon of choice, with the added wrinkle of living weapon. My living weapon doesn't last all that long without Emerita to fuel it, but his usage and subsequent lightning buff lasts for ages. My resistance to it was pathetic too. His mighty blows not only carried the weight of demolishing your HP, it slowed your movements to a crawl with the lightning status. It didn't stop me from sprinting away endlessly, which ended up being my strategy. Evade the eventual strike, then counter against the spear's pointed weakness. The difficulty here really rided on that melt or be melted line I mentioned in the previous video, but skewed more toward getting melted in a single burst while needing multiple near perfect windows to claim victory of your own. Outside of his buff, it's generally easy and safe to run around his thrusts and smash him, rinse and repeat. During his buff, however, he turned up the hyper armor. Between that and his tremendous damage output, offensive gambits became a deadly proposition. That was more than enough to shave a few lives off of me, but it was still doable thanks to my experience against Spear Revenants. Plus, his use of Living Weapon was more simple than his peers. Even so, the handful of deaths made me fear the spear, enough to raise Shima beyond the average. Number 11, Toyotomi Hideyori. As you'll soon see, there were some DLC bosses that shredded me unlike any other bosses in Nioh. During my battle with Toyotomi, I realized I made a huge mistake that inflated this challenge. In my build, I had a Magatama that let me have one less piece than needed to get set benefits. At one point, I got the spear for the Red Demon set, so I traded it out for the Warrior of the West sword. Problem is, I swapped it out for the Warrior of the West chestplate, which gave me B mobility instead of A. When I noticed the source of my sluggish ki regen and realized how ki maximum mobility was to my aggressive playstyle, I decided screw it. I'll forgo the second layer of benefits on the Warrior of the West and go all in on the Red Demon gear. In spite of losing the close combat damage buff from the Warrior of the West, my mobility and ki regen increased dramatically. It made dodging far easier than before, making this battle a matter of wait for an attack, dodge, then use my increased speed to counter. Outside of his demonic living weapon buff, this is another Revenant-like experience, this time with dual swords. That meant using speed to get behind him gave bonus damage and a stagger. This made offensive windows with my glass cannon build safe as long as I could pull off the initial dodge. In fact, I think if I hadn't let up in my first speedy attempt, I might have skipped second phase. Since I pulled up though, I was a bit nervous and nearly choked away the victory, but I swapped to low for a quick blow and got the photo finish. Toyotomi's tough, but like most human bosses, it's more thanks to the low protection of my build maximizing his damage and having hyper armor to push through my overly aggressive style. I can't tank attacks whatsoever. Hell, I get one shot by plenty of them because Sakura Sagama is trash at parrying and blocking. But hey, that's the trade-off to being a glass cannon. Toyotomi exploits my style enough to push toward the top 10, but has a simplistic moveset that makes speedy dodge and counter strategies plenty manageable, keeping him from higher heights. Number 10, Ogress. What happens when you put a speedy giant with high range and damage in a shoebox? Pain and lots of it. Her ability to swipe and turn 180 degrees on a dime to exploit my typical strategy of sprinting to Yokai's boss's backside threw me for a loop. In fact, doing damage from behind did far less than smacking her face, and even had a weird hitbox through her large robes. That said, some of her attacks like the leaping slam are a joke to punish with a well-timed quickstep. Even the melee attacks from the front are manageable if you aren't careless, which to a degree I was. I became used to sprinting through Yokai's moves for openings, and at least half of her move pool made that an easy route to death. My unwillingness to quickly adapt to what I was facing made the Ogress harder than she probably is in reality. She likely belongs on the first half of the list, but thanks to making things more challenging for myself, she winds up as our first entry in the top 10. Number 9, Nioh. Nioh is the same story as the Ogress to a larger degree. With a single attack, Nioh could punish my propensity for R1 spamming during the smallest of openings. With hardly a moment's notice, Nioh will roar backward and summon 2 bolts of lightning. Their range is restricted to a short radius around the body, a perfect bit of balance, as long as you aren't carelessly spamming attacks that is. I died countless times to the Thunder Pussy thanks to my own greed as a result of this single attack. I was ready to come in swinging with a rant about how bullshit this is. That the damage is far too high for a single strike this early in the game, that you shouldn't be able to summon it alongside a ki regen roar, and that this clearly overtuned garbage was the game's fault, not mine. But taking even a moment to honestly reflect shows a weakness in my stubbornness to adapt. Other attacks like summoning 4 bolts of lightning gives a solid window to get a hit or 2 in with clever positioning. The melee swipes that were later repurposed for the White Tiger are quick but avoidable. The charge up lightning attack that I said I hate is a great moment to dodge and booty smack. Both its backside and mouth can blast away, a perfect time to go on the offensive. I will argue that the downtime between Nioh's attacks should be a bit greater, but for the most part, Nioh is balanced very well. The ability to summon lightning on itself or anywhere around the arena are given a generous tell, and if you can do basic evasion, the close-up attacks are manageable and leave gaping holes to counter. Facing Nioh later in the game with a better understanding of Nioh's mechanics and a more balanced strategy made it clear how poor my initial fights were. The fact stands that they were rough in my initial run of the main mission, making it easy to place Nioh in the upper ranks. Number 8, Hino-Enma. The bane of many fresh playthroughs, this vampire feasting on the souls of newbies could have made it even higher if it weren't for me channeling my inner dodge god. Without any paralytic needle to my name, I went in headlong knowing full well the horror I'd face, only to win on my second attempt. So why does Hino-Enma leap over nearly 20 bosses in spite of her low kill count on me? Executing and achieving that victory required a level of precise dodging in high quantities at an alarming rate. Between that, you need to find proper time to get in an attack, something she can easily turn against you with the smack of an umbrella, or worse, a quick shot of paralysis. Through some miracle of my own making, I didn't get paralyzed a single time, but if you do, it's a near guaranteed loss. I will note that her shots of this nature from the sky are easy to sprint away from, and her charge that comes in after, while fast, leaves a nice opening to hit her back if you can dodge. Once you break her ki, that's your time to unleash Living Weapon and use it to steamroll her low health pool. This is what shocked me looking back. I know full well that she had a low health pool, and yet I played unlike the brash fool I illustrated in the last 2 ranks. It's no real mystery, however. I fully remember the many beatings she unleashed in my first playthrough back in 2017, and that was more than enough to make me cautious. Despite my temporary change in temperament, execution was a higher order of difficulty than the footage may show. For that, Hino-Enma soars to heights beyond much of her competition. Number 7, Sanada Yukimara. Damage Incarnate. This entire level was littered with absurdly tanky enemies dishing out boss level damage, so Yukimura's devastating DPS came as no surprise. I did try out Sloth and could see the value immediately. That said, even though I tested its effectiveness on most bosses, there were very few I actually used it on in real attempts after Yuki-Onna, primarily because I didn't want this ranking to become ranking the Nioh bosses from most to least resistant to Sloth. Instead, I decided to invest in other magic and ninjutsu. I had boosted lightning damage bonuses on my armor, used the corresponding talisman, popped a power pill, cast weakness into Vigorate talismans, and was off to the races. His damage is ridiculous, but this made it more manageable. My build is designed not to take hits and dish out consecutive damage with careful positioning, but Sanada's hyper armor makes that non-viable. My cocktail of buffs and debuffs changed this completely, allowing me to trade some damage. Putting them into action was a cinch thanks to his immediate cast of Living Weapon and the following flashy slam. That doesn't mean it was easy, of course. It still took proper timing and effort to secure the win, but I have to admit it could have been much harder without my strategy. Thing is, I don't think that's due to his mechanics. The mission level here was 200, while the DLC doesn't offer gear in new game beyond 150. This is an assumption on my end, but I would imagine with the DLC releasing months after launch, they surely wanted to balance it in a way that veterans who dabbled in the higher difficulties a bit could enjoy it. My evidence is my own experience in Way of the Strong and Way of the Demon, in other words New Game Plus and New Game Plus 2. The final DLC missions in New Game are all harder than any main mission felt in Way of the Strong, but they aren't quite as hard as Way of the Demon. Thing is, going through Way of the Strong and returning to the DLC and New Game closer to the mission level made some of the bosses just as easy as the beatdowns in the lower half of the list, bringing me to my frustration with Nioh's difficulty. When you're properly scaled, the difficulty is either balanced well or skews too far to the easy end. When not properly scaled, you're an insect getting swatted by constant overpowered attacks. But I don't think a boss should ever be consistently killing you in 1 or 2 hits without some balance in your favor. Hence my necessity to lean on buffs and debuffs. Thing is, many players won't have access to these early on in their playthrough, or even know about them thanks to the overwhelming depth of Nioh's underexplained progression. This reminded me of my eventual drop of the game back in 2017 after Yuki-Onna. I faced her in a mission recommending level 55, and I had level and gear both below level 40. As a result, I got obliterated in a way that wasn't fun, and it was enough to make me expect the same would continue. My point is to say that it's extremely apparent why the detractors to Nioh continue to argue their distaste for it. The balance of levels and bosses is heavily weighted to how prepared you are for it numerically instead of in raw skill. And the New Game DLC jumps far beyond what levels you can keep up with unless you head through New Game Plus. But at that point, you would think you should be doing the New Game Plus DLC, right? It's a strange design decision since that question could have been the answer to serving the DLC to veterans who went beyond their initial playthrough. I will give a moment of due credit to the game's eventual ability to scale challenge well in the higher game cycles and the Abyss, but that's because you're expected to have a fully optimized build to handle what it dishes out. The likelihood you have that in your first playthrough is minimal at best. Forgive me for the long tangent away from Sanada, but it's necessary to give context for what's to come. All that remains on the list are DLC bosses. Understanding how undergeared and underleveled I was relative to these missions is a big part of why they dominate the top of the list. As for Yukimura, there isn't much to say outside of his imposing damage. He's a basic revenant that uses Living Weapon for fire and wind to add in a few interesting attacks, and I do love that end of his design. The attacks are very unique, exciting, and have great mechanics in terms of evasion. It's just a shame I couldn't enjoy the mechanics in a battle of attrition since most of them one-shot me. My cocktail of magic and power pills turned what could have been a poorly scaled nightmare into something much more manageable, yet still enough to rank at number 7. Number 6, Sanada Yukimara Rematch. Same oppressive damage, smaller arena. Not a fan of reusing bosses for paid DLC, even if it makes sense as part of the story. You fight him again, but this time he ganks you with Sarutobi Sasuke. What a thrill. There were a handful of commenters asking why I chose to exclude the side missions that paired two bosses together to gank you since their difficulty is so notable. Outside of trying to keep this ranking from an absurd boss count, my reason is simple. Tossing two bosses together that are designed to be fought solo in a 2-on-1 menage a trois is a clusterfuck of arbitrary difficulty. They weren't designed to be fought together at all, making it a mess you can juggle your way out of, but I personally wouldn't have much fun doing it. The only time this ham-fisted inflation of difficulty is forced on you is a rematch with Sanada. The exception in this case is that he is the sole boss you need to KO. Once he's defeated, Sasuke throws in the towel. Plus, Sasuke doesn't show up until the halfway point, so there was at least some thought put into this chaotic rodeo. Their damage is still insane due to the level gap, but if you're careful, you can YOLO through 45% of Sanada's health bar without him summoning Sasuke. He won't summon him until 50%, so you can plan your next moment to strike carefully. With my glass cannon, it was possible to blow his HP to 0 at the right moment, making Sasuke a non-factor. If I had to actually defeat both, they'd surely rank higher on the list. But with my careful strategy, his rematch barely outranks the initial fight. Number 5, Nine-Tailed Fox. The final DLC fight is a living weapon embodied in a boss. Nioh 2 is clearly leaking. It's a big yokai-style battle, but with speed that rivals some of the fastest human counterparts. A few melee swipes, a backflip tail slam, an insta-kill grab, a tail swipe that can be single or tossed quickly into the middle of a combo, rock tosses, homing fireballs, all with varying levels of generous tells that are mixed together so quickly it can make your head spin. I use spacing to the best of my ability to stay away from her more lethal attacks. You're lucky in that you're given a mandatory partner because he definitely saved my ass taking aggro away. She did keep the majority of her focus narrowed to me, but the arena was large enough to run away and get a brief window to cast Sloth, so I had time to throw on other debuffs. Up close, Sloth was actually more harmful than helpful. It may make her openings more lengthy, but it also made reading and timing dodges way harder than usual. Plus, I found that the more I debuffed her, the faster the initial ones wore off. Mixing all of my magic, aggression, and skills, I managed to pull off a victory fairly fast, but it felt like I managed to get lucky in terms of RNG with her using her more generous attacks and was able to go full out aggression. It was pretty difficult to break her ki before she went into her second phase, which had a lot scarier attacks like energy shockwaves that could one-shot me. It seemed like her ki was even more difficult to break in this phase, but it was balanced by her sometimes sitting still to buff for a nice damage window. Overall, it was a solidly enjoyable fight. On the difficulty end, her damage, speed, and size is a brutal combination that forces you to make full use of your build to this point to squeak out a victory. But inconsistent pressure exacerbated further by the NPC helping you suppresses her from anything higher than number 5. Number 4, Onmoraki. Take everything I said about the Ogress in New and then have most attacks one-shot you. That's Big Bird in a nutshell. It makes use of wind to debuff your attack, making the fight painfully long if you do manage to survive a hit, decreasing the margin for error dramatically. As much as I'd love to go into great detail about every bit of pain this boss can put you through, it's really that simple. I was on the verge in nearly every attempt to cook in this turkey, but all it took was a single poor dodge for it all to be in vain. Admittedly, like New in the Ogress, my aggression was way over the top and I deserved every single one of those losses. Once I finally took it at a slower pace, I was able to come out on top. But even then, I found many attacks like the spin challenging to dodge. Like the rest of the DLC, I was about 60 levels under geared. In Onmoraki's case, I think it made as big of a difference offensively as it did defensively. Considering how close I was at this level, if I had been appropriately equipped, I think this would have been a bottom tier roast taking my damage output into account. But in the reality I did face it in, its imposing damage mixed in with my greed caused over an hour of deaths that push it near the top 3. Number 3, Date Masamune. The jump from 4 to 3 is massive. Though the handful of DLC bosses that precede it were tough, Date brings it to a brutal level that had me stuck for hours. In terms of design, it's par for the course, on the surface at least. He starts off with basic weapons, then pulls out 2 flavors of living weapon, both with their own terrifying uses. Where he goes beyond the surface level comparison is his high pursuit in both standard speed and charge attacks from afar. Without a buff, I could barely live his charge at full health. In living weapon, forget about it. The charge covers more than half of the arena, and though it might seem like a great time to attack if you can counter it, his hyper armor is just as strong as any other living weapon users. The one saving grace was my discovery of how to outlast the buff. As he uses attacks in this phase, his ki drains. Once the tank is empty, he reverts to his old self. This is your cue to be as aggressive as possible because it's not long before he buffs again. That said, his standard phase offers more than enough punishment to make short work of you with even the slightest error in judgment. My build didn't have enough ability to block or parry, so wombo combos staggered me and killed me. His charge killed me. His AoE slams killed me. And he had speed with all these that made evasion truly difficult. Imagine stringing together an entire fight that required perfect evasion throughout and flawless decision making for when and how long to go on the offensive. One slip in judgment and it's back to square one. I will say that his water set of attacks is easier to handle than the wind, but both are still hellish experiences. Even so, I thoroughly enjoyed the beating. Call me a masochist, but underneath the wealth of one-hit kills, I could see the fantastic design. The only thing I can point to as unfair is his damage level, but I know that would have changed if I were properly geared. Without that, I had to play an uncharacteristically defensive game that put all of my skills to the test in an engaging way. Putting all of this into action is one of the harder boss fights in recent memory for any game, which makes it all the more impressive that there's still 2 to go. Number 2, Maria. Lady Maria decided to pay feudal Japan a visit, and she's taking no prisoners. You'll see this in after each death as she taunts you for being weak, and goddamn there were a lot of deaths. Whenever this type of game gives you a checkpoint right before the boss, you know it's about to get serious. In contrast to Date, she doesn't have the best defenses. Okay, that's not entirely accurate. Her best defense is more offense. A lady after my own heart. Thing is, she has the hyper armor and damage numbers to execute this strategy in a way I never could against her. Sloth made her slower, but her speed is so fast it's only useful for applying other buffs since it just makes dodge timing harder. So I said screw it, I'm gonna cast a weakness talisman and claim victory through dodging and show her, at least once, that my hyper offense can win the day. It took over 50 attempts, but I eventually succeeded. Her combos stagger and melt my entire health bar before I can recover. The variations on her sword strikes throws off your evasion, and her grab is quick and landing it means instant death. My only path to victory was to dodge her flurry or grab, then counter briefly. She eventually buffs and uses magic that offers more generous windows to attack with proper counters. But I really can't overstate how hard it was to even string together 3 successful counters in a single fight. That's what's so impressive. Each counter I did could shave off enough life that I'd only need 4 or 5 good ones to win. But it was so damn hard to pull them off consecutively without getting one-shot by nearly everything she did. To me, this was further evidence of the power gap. Since her mission is so easy to repeat, I went back after completing New Game Plus 1 and 2 with level 180 gear, and it only took 3 attempts before I was able to demolish her paltry health pool. She couldn't one-shot me anymore, but I'm not gonna pretend it wasn't still terrifying. Her damage is still insane, and the downtime between her assaults is minuscule. If it weren't for our final entry, she would take the cake and then some as Nioh's hardest main mission boss. Well, technically, I suppose she is. Despite my avoidance of the side missions in this ranking, our number 1 boss was unique enough that he had to make the list. And the number 1 hardest boss in Nioh, Jin Hayabusa. You know, I remember playing Ninja Gaiden Black as a kid and getting my ass kicked. It's good to know times haven't changed. Of all the bosses on the list, he has a lethal combination of 3 things in the highest doses: blistering speed, gargantuan damage output, and a ki pool the size of an ocean. He had ninjutsu, magic, and melee attacks from close up and a range. Kunai, explosive shuriken, a one-shot fireball, and a leaping attack that led to death 95% of the time. These things are scary, but they also can be a slight crack in his armor. The throwable ninjutsu, not so much, but the cast time on the fireball and the leaping attack are weak points, in theory anyway. The flying attack has such a quick tell, you'd be lucky to dodge or react to it, but if you use a shuriken or activate living weapon, you'll knock him down. As for the fireball, I eventually realized that I never did master the dojo missions. Thank God I realized this after I killed every other boss on the list, because it allowed me to cast magic at a faster rate, which surely would have been useful, but it's almost mandatory if you want to debuff Jin. His fireball is the perfect time to do it because it forces him to stay still, and because otherwise he rolls away from your magic shots. This allowed me to debuff at least one of his 3 massive advantages: defense, speed, or ki regeneration. This finally let a small breeze from a crack in the window in that I could ride to victory. I'll say this, I'm by no means great at this game. Most of my strategies were one-dimensional and relied on brute forcing my way with basic combos to win with magic to make up for deficiencies in my skill. This was passable on most bosses, but only served to give me an inkling of advantage here. That wasn't until I discovered the Kurosagame's ultimate move against human bosses: Serpent Strike, Foot Sweep, Curb Stomp, Repeat. I am honestly really glad I didn't find out about this until this boss, because it would have trivialized a lot of the others even more. On Jin, however, even if this seems a little cheesy, I still needed to find perfect moments or he'd counter with instant death. Debuffs and balancing between this combo and melee assaults of my own were enough for me to claim the victory after 3 hours of defeat. Keep in mind that my gear was over 100 levels below the 265 recommendation the mission suggests. Though I never got gear on that level, I did eventually go back around the low 200s, and the difference was staggering. Yet another reinforcement that Nioh's difficulty is based heavily around being geared properly. Even so, he still kicked my ass plenty then too. I was just happy I was able to consistently win every 5 attempts or so. Jin's movements are so fast and against the favor of the player that it's hard for me to celebrate him as a paragon of quality. But I still felt that signature boss euphoria when I finally got the win. It was without question the hardest one I earned in my time with Nioh, giving Jin the top honors for its boss difficulty. But of course, that's just my opinion. What bosses in Nioh did you find the most challenging? Let us know in the comments below. Please consider leaving a like if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe for more boss rankings and gaming essays to come. I want to thank you all for watching today. Much love to you, and I'll see you in the next video.